Yeah, man. If you're good, let's
go.
Let's dive into it.
All right.
All right. Hell yeah. Well, thank you, Robbie. I appreciate you joining me. It's nice to finally meet you, and I'm glad we can kind of do it in this venue. So
absolutely, man. It looks good in here, and I appreciate you having me on.
Hell yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Looks good.
But yeah, so if you can just give everybody the rundown of who you are, what you do, and yeah, let's just dive into it, dude.
All right, man. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Kentucky. That's right, where there's a lot of bourbon and horse racing. I partake more in the bourbon than anything else from time to time. I went to the University of Louisville for undergrad. I double majored in philosophy and humanities with a minor in religious studies. And I also worked myself through undergrad by working at UPS in Louisville. I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you get an overnight package through UPS, there's probably like a 98% chance that you see Louisville on the I don't know, when you look it up on the internet.
Yeah, on like the transit path.
That's right. That's because they sort everything, or virtually everything, every night at the Louisville International Airport at what they call the Worldport Hub. And what they do is they need to staff it. So one of the things they do is they offer, for example, like I said, I went to the University of Louisville. They actually paid for my college to go there. Now, the downfall was you work between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m., okay, in the middle of the night.
Yep.
And as a result of that, when I decided that I was going to go to law school, because, what's a philosophy major actually going to get me, right? I mean, nothing. I'm not going to philosophize on the street, or, well, I mean, I guess if I was like homeless, that's what I could do, right?
I think I enjoy philosophy too, so I think after we kind of dive into what you do, I think let's definitely philosophize right here.
We can do it. All right, then I guess my degree will come in handy in this context. I went to, so I decided to go to law school, and I essentially drew a line below Tennessee and said, somewhere there. And Miami let me in first, and then you start getting on the internet and looking at Miami, and you're like, okay, and then you sell yourself pretty quickly. So I went to the University of Miami for law school. I came over here to the West Coast to start practicing law, and I've essentially done more or less trust and estates. I did some real property stuff early on. But I've done trust and estates law for the past at least 7 years. I've been practicing for 8, and I still did some even in that first year. While practicing, I also got my LLM in taxation from New York University, which helps me. And I'm also board certified in wills, trust, and estate, which is a distinction that I want to say 7 or 8% of attorneys have in Florida.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fairly nice to have, and it also allows you to call yourself as an expert in certain fields. So technically, I can call myself an expert in wills, trusts, and estates and things associated with that. I actually like the board certification, not necessarily, well, to be honest, because I'm a younger attorney. I can't go around saying that I have 30 or 40 years of experience until I have 30 or 40 years of experience. But when you're sitting across from a client, you want them, and not just a client, but people that, referral sources, which, could be financial advisors, CPAs, there's a number of people that can do that.
Sure.
You want them to have an understanding that you at least have some base level of knowing what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
So that's essentially what I am. Now, as far as my business, I am the owner of the Merriman Law Firm. We opened 6 months ago. I was working at a firm downtown and running the trust and estates department. And I decided that it made sense for me, to go out on my own. Plus, I'm in Bonita Springs. I'm actually off Coconut Road. I think it's technically Bonita Springs, but it's literally the line that divides Bonita and Estero.
Yep.
So, and I live in Estero, so it made sense for me to come down here. And it's a beautiful area and a great place to practice. And in that context, I do wills, trusts, estates, and guardianships, and I'll try to give a 30,000-foot view more or less of what that is.
I was going to ask, so what does that entail? But you're on the path, so let's go.
I feel like I've actually been conducting interviews this week, and I feel like as part of the interview, I've been, when I interview these people, I want to tell them about the practice. So it's like I got it all teed up for you, right? It's like I've been practicing for this moment right here, and
it's the interviews, it's the philosophy degree.
It's
perfect
such
time.
A match, right? Well, when it comes to estate planning, generally speaking, I think of it 3 ways. Number one, you are planning for death, and you're talking about the disposition of property upon death. Not only who gets it, but how they get it, whether they get it in a trust, whether it's okay to make outright distributions. And I could bore you with the monotonous details of that, but just, there's some issues there that have to be discussed with every client. Another thing that you want to do is you want to plan for incapacity. And that means, obviously as people get older, they could get dementia, they could get Alzheimer's. And there are certain documents that you put in place that can kind of help and assist with that. So when it comes to planning for death, a lot of times you're talking about a will, or a lot of times you're talking about a trust, particularly a revocable trust, which kind of operates as a will substitute. When it comes to planning for incapacity, a trust can also be beneficial with that. But some of the additional documents, let's say, could be a durable power of attorney, designation of healthcare surrogate, which you pick somebody to make healthcare decisions in the event you're incapacitated, a living will, and that's the document that says something to the effect of, if I have a end-stage terminal condition, if I'm in a persistent vegetative state, and there's no reasonable likelihood of my medical recovery, then you can remove life-sustaining treatment. And then you can also designate or draft a document called, or I should say execute it from the client's perspective, a document called a designation of pre-need guardian. And that's a document where you say, look, if the court ever has to appoint a guardian, I'd like to pick who that is, and this is the person that I would put forward to the court. And the court generally is going to honor that unless there's a compelling reason not to. So, for example, if I said that I wanted Charlie Manson to be my, designate him as my pre-need guardian, and Charlie, he's dead, right? Did I read that? Yeah, I think he's dead.
I don't know.
Well, if he was still around, I don't think the court
representative.
It depends, right? It depends. Maybe if he was running like your, I don't know, like you're in the music industry or something like that. Yeah. It seems like he would have a very keen interest in that, if I'm not mistaken. He was a huge Beatles and particularly White Album fan, right? Yeah, and that's, I don't know. But that's kind of, from a big view, that's the estate planning side. Now, I also do probate administration and trust administration. And we were talking about wills and we were talking about trust previously. And, those people ultimately pass away. And the reason that they drafted a trust and the reason they drafted a will in many cases is to make sure their property gets where it needs to get. So when they pass away, a lot of the times I'm retained by the new trustee of the trust or a personal representative of the estate or just merely family members, that don't even know what's going on at the time, and you have to walk them through it to assist them with administering a trust and assist them with administering an estate, that kind of stuff. I also do guardianships. As I mentioned before, sometimes people become incapacitated. They may have dementia or Alzheimer's. You can also see people just have mental health issues that can lead them, down that road. And this is for people that they can't manage their property and they can't make decisions that are related to, let's say, their health care or their social environment, things of that nature.
Sure.
And in those situations, a lot of the times I'm representing family members to get a guardian appointed to where the guardian essentially substitutes in to manage, for example, the property or to manage, it's called the person. I mean, basically guardianships are bifurcated into a guardian of the person and a guardian of the property.
Okay.
The guardian of the property is probably the most easy to understand. The guardian essentially, let's start with it's called a ward. It would be the person that's incapacitated. And when the petition's initiated, they're actually called an alleged incapacitated person.
Oh, until like legally confirmed.
Exactly. So
okay.
And maybe it's better to just expand on this a little bit. Essentially, what the court's doing in a guardianship proceeding is they're doing two things. Number one, they're determining whether the alleged incapacitated person is in fact incapacitated and to what extent that person is incapacitated. Okay. And they do this primarily by having an examining committee go out and interview the alleged incapacitated person. It's a 3-member committee, and they each issue a report. Now, most of the time, those reports are just simply admitted in as evidence at an evidentiary hearing, and the court makes a determination on that. So if someone's totally incapacitated, what happens is they lose all their what's called a non-delegable right and a delegable right. So a non-delegable right is like a right to vote. And the reason it's non-delegable is because the guardian can't exercise it. So if a guardian is appointed for an alleged incapacitated person, they can't go vote for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody loses all their delegable rights, let's say it's like the right to sue and defend lawsuits, the right to contract, the right to generally manage property, then it's delegable, which means the guardian can come in and exercise those rights on behalf of the ward. So they can manage the ward's property. And you can see the language that I'm talking about now. I've used the word ward. Once somebody's established as being incapacitated at any level, they're no longer an alleged incapacitated person. They become the ward. So that's where that comes in. So, and like I said before, it's kind of bifurcated into person or property. And
so where does the person vary? So the person more comes down to their rights versus the property.
Well, this is what I would say. I think there's delegable and non-delegable rights on both sides. But I am bifurcating it between guardian of the person and guardian of the property because a lot of times in litigated circumstances you kind of differentiate. But most of the time, the truth is, it's a plenary guardianship over everything. Okay? That's typically what happens. And most of the time, my clients are not reaching out to me until it's significant and there's a real problem. So a lot of the time, the examining committee comes back and they're like, this person is totally incapacitated and it's very straightforward and they're guardian of every delegable right, whether it's person or property. Now, as I mentioned before, property is what you think it is. It's pretty straightforward, and it also includes the right to contract, sue and defend lawsuits, make gifts or dispositions, things like that. The guardian of the person is more related to medical treatment, social environment, so who they can see and hang out with. Let's imagine that they, for whatever reason, they have a bad person in their life that's taking advantage of them. Maybe the guardian of the person can make sure that person's not affecting that anymore. And things more or less of that nature. So that's kind of how a guardianship works. And just tying that back, when I was talking about estate planning, I was specifically talking about the documents you have planning for incapacity. Okay, so after a court determines that someone's incapacitated, they actually look and ask the question whether there's a lesser restrictive alternative to a guardianship. And the reason is because Florida courts do not favor guardians. Okay, and they do not favor removing rights from individuals, okay? Because you have to understand that if you get your rights removed for a guardianship, in some situations, I mean, you're not actually in prison, so hear me out, but in some situations, you lose more rights than a convicted felon may lose, okay? You know, they can still manage their own property.
Yeah.
They don't lose the right to do that. They can still, once they get out, at least at some level, determine their social environment. I know there may be restrictions on that if, you know, depending on certain issues, but you lose a lot of rights, okay?
That's what the non-delegable kind of got my head spinning with that in terms of like voting, all these
voting,
different kind of things that you could actually take away from somebody. So I guess in a way,
marriage is one.
Yeah, it does make sense that you would want to keep that as almost like a last resort.
Exactly. So the court looks to see whether you have, and these are what are commonly referred to as advanced directives. So, for example, what a durable power of attorney does is it appoints an agent, which is actually called an attorney in fact, to be able to take to make certain property, engage, I should say, in certain property transactions, okay? If the courts, in issuing an order of incapacity, says this person can't manage their property, they may go, okay, well, is there a durable power of attorney? Is there an attorney in fact out there that can actually manage it on their behalf? Or is there a trust? Is this property in a trust, and is there a successor trustee under the trust that can take over and then manage the property? And if the answer to that question is yes, the court should, or primarily, it depends on the issue and who the trustee is, and there may be a million circumstances surrounding this.
Sure.
But typically we'll go, okay, well, we don't need to appoint a guardian of the property because they have a power of attorney and they have a trust with a successor trustee that can just be appointed. And because there's no other property that falls outside that spectrum, and and assuming it's sufficient for what they need, we'll just appoint that or we'll just, find that they're incapacitated, which will lead to the power of attorney is still, if it's durable, that's the key term, but the durable power of attorney comes into effect, and then the trust provisions will likely apply to appoint the successor trustee, and we're good.
Okay.
Similarly, if if one of the issues is related to healthcare, and let's just say they can't manage their healthcare, okay, or their decisions regarding their health and their medical care, the court may go, okay, well, do they designate a healthcare surrogate? And if they have a designation of healthcare surrogate issued or executed, and it's all well and good, then the court may go, okay, well, we don't need to appoint a guardian to do this because we have a healthcare surrogate appointed.
It's already taken care of.
Exactly.
They already laid it out with the living wills or whatever the vehicle.
All the documents we were talking about before. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's basically like the mindset is take that route because this is what they wanted, this is what they had set up, and we also don't have to get into this slippery zone of taking away people's rights and then maybe having
the rights, to be fair, the rights are still taken away.
Okay.
But you're still trying to give them as much autonomy as they can because in a way they've already pre-decided who they wanted to serve in these capacities.
Got it. Okay.
And then ultimately if a court says, listen, the documents just aren't sufficient, or we have an issue, or maybe the agent they named died or something like that, so it's not around anymore, or they live so far away and the care needs to be more here. The court may go, look, we got to appoint a guardian anyway, or at least for some rights we have to, or for some things we have to appoint a guardian. Then we still have that designation of pre-need guardian document that may apply where the court's like, okay, well, they asked for this person to be a guardian. Let's let this person do it. And if that document's not around, then the court ultimately will just decide on, who they think the best fit is. And there's a number of factors they still look at. For example, sometimes you have incapacitated people that might have dementia, and they may say, I want this daughter, not that daughter, to be my guardian. Okay, that happens sometimes, and the court's supposed to take that into account. Where the alleged incapacitated person or the ward cannot articulate who they want it to be, the court will actually look to what the family members want. There's other factors to take into account. It's a very exhaustive statute for good reason, obviously, given what we're talking about in the context of it. Yeah,
it all sounds pretty reasonable. Like it all sounds like, okay, yeah, if you didn't have this planned out, here's where you'd go next. And then if you don't have that planned out, here's where you go next. Like,
exactly.
That would be kind of my first thought would be like, okay, well, see if they've got anything. Okay, if not, go ask the kids and go from there.
Absolutely. And yeah, so that's how that breaks down. I did want to circle back because I was talking about estate planning earlier. And I mentioned, obviously we do, you're planning for death and then you're also planning for incapacity. But you also want to do that in a tax-effective manner. And that is part of my practice, is to the extent that we're talking about the estate and gift tax or the generation skipping transfer tax or income tax as it's related to trust and estates and planning for that. I also do that as well. And I think that's important to understand because while the exemption right now is significantly high, I think it's around $12.8 million. And that means that if I die and the total amount of taxable gifts in my estate when I die is less than that, I'm not paying any taxes on it, okay? And that's the overwhelming majority of people. Cool. But it's possible, and I still don't think I wouldn't fall in this category, but if Congress passes a law tomorrow and they say, listen, if you die with $1 million or $2 million, you're going to bring a lot more people into the fold. But that's something else I do, just as an aside, and I like to... so when I talk about estate planning, and I omitted that, I do think about those three things: planning for death, planning for incapacity, and then obviously trying to do it in a tax-effective manner. Got it. Now, we went through that, and obviously the probate and trust administration and the guardianships. And the last thing that I do is I litigate those issues as well. There are a lot of practitioners, very good practitioners, that do everything that I talked about previously. I think there's a fewer amount of those that actually litigate these issues for various reasons. I mean, some people just don't like to litigate. That's not what they want to do. And litigation in this context would be, for example, you have competing wills. So let's say that someone executed a will 5 years ago, and it said that I'm going to give all of my property to my son and my daughter equally, and then someone a couple of days before they died, while they're in their deathbed, got a couple witnesses and a notary gathered around and signed a new document that just so happened to be prepared by the daughter that gives the daughter everything. Sure. You can contest that, okay, for various reasons. Let's say that you have a trustee of a trust and, the settlor, the person that created the trust, has already died, and the trust is set up in such a way where it essentially continues to operate and property stays in trust, and there's various provisions in there that talk about how to distribute the property to the beneficiary. And let's say that the beneficiary doesn't believe the trustee is properly distributing, the property to them, or they are not properly providing an accounting to them, which is required, or something along those lines. In that case, the beneficiary can sue the trustee to obtain an accounting, for damages, to remove the trustee. There could be a number of issues. Sure. In the guardianship context, you could have a situation where maybe you have a son and a daughter and both believe dad's incapacitated, but they also both want to be the guardian. Okay, and let's say there's no documents that really indicate anything, then obviously you might be litigating over who's better suited, and you may even propose a professional guardian to resolve that, situation, which you see a lot of the time. Sure. But I do litigation on that as well, which I enjoy, and I actually think my litigation, or I would like to say that it helps me in my estate planning, because if I see, I don't want to even call them mistakes, because as attorneys we can't foresee everything that happens. But if you see an issue that happens in your litigation, you might go, maybe when I'm drafting my estate planning documents or in the method that I'm executing these things, maybe I want to take this into consideration to make sure it doesn't happen with my client, right? Something to look out for. So, well, and it's also too, if you're doing the litigation on that, it really, and I'm totally speaking out of school here, so feel free to correct me. It's all good. But it sounds like if you're doing the litigation, that is also kind of part of the ground game in some of these situations where you're actually hands-on and resolving issues. So I could see how that would work, because I guess if you go in and you're doing this litigation, you're dealing with these real world situations, which I'm sure none of them are, well, most probably aren't simple, hence why you would get involved with litigation. But knowing what goes on and the way people react and kind of the messed up things that people do to each other around death, you can actually kind of prepare these documents and give better advice and set up these wills and trusts, maybe with
a couple steps in advance to know, like, here are some of the pitfalls that you're going to encounter. I've seen this get real ugly. I would do X, Y, and Z to kind of get around this or mitigate it as much as possible.
Absolutely. And that's what we try to do. I mean, one of the biggest things is even having, a lot of times you have a client that maybe they're in their 70s or 80s and they really trust one of their children. And there's probably 90% of the time, there's absolutely good reason to do that. They're just trying to help. They don't really want to get involved or care. But some of those times it's the child that calls the office to set the appointment, right? And, it's one of those things where when I meet with a client, I don't want that child to sit in there. And it's not merely that it, how do I say this? The person that's protected in that situation would be the client, not necessarily simply because they're doing, let's say their daughter is doing anything wrong. But Florida law, has certain badges of, for example, something called undue influence. And if, for example, let's say that you have a will, like I talked about before, and it left everything equally to the son and the daughter. And then let's say there's a new will. Now, let's say it's not on the deathbed or anything like that, okay? Now, let's say that I get a call from the daughter, and the daughter's like, hey, I want to bring my dad in, to see you. And, maybe the intake staff goes, okay, well, first they're instructed right away to say, okay, well, when your dad comes in to see us, we can make the appointment. But just understand the fact that if your dad can drive himself, he should drive himself. And, either way, Attorney Merriman's going to want to meet with your dad alone. And number one, if they seem to have an issue with that, then the answer is 99% of the time, unless there's a compelling reason,
sure.
It's like, maybe they're the only child, okay, which is a different thing. But in this context, it's like, okay, well, then they can go call someone else because I don't want to get involved with something like that. And the reason for that is, like I was saying before, there's certain situations or certain badges of undue influence. So if you are the one that calls the attorney to set the appointment, particularly if you're there when they express a desire to make a will, or you're there when the will is executed and you have knowledge of what's in the will, there's all these things that are factors that a court considers in evaluating undue influence. I want to cut as many of those out as possible, right? Not to mention, I also want to make sure the client, understands what's happening. And look, most of the time this isn't an issue. And most of the time, even if I get a call from someone, related to the client, they're like, oh yeah, that's fine. No big deal. It's not a thing. But when you see that stuff happen, again and again, my litigation cases, there's always generally something kind of like that going on, or depending on the case and everything. But if it's a will contest case, there's something going on in those cases. And most of the will contest cases are based in undue influence, or at least undue influence is probably a cause of action or a claim that's being brought in those cases, I would say.
Got it. So just extracting that from the process or cutting it out as much as possible makes it way easier.
We're not perfect, but we have a duty and responsibility to our clients to do the best we can in those situations. Sure. So that's what we're trying to do. It's as simple as that. I mean, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. You don't know what happens when they leave the door or go outside or anything like that. And you can't know, okay? Mm-hmm. But I can control, at least to some level, what happens in my office. And the last thing that I want to do is have them do something they wouldn't want to do. And if they come to my office and hopefully they drive themselves there, have somebody else bring them or something like that, we can have a more honest conversation if they don't think the person is, waiting outside the door, or particularly if the person was sitting right there when they were executing the documents. That's a little bit of a problem. So
yeah. I mean, apply that situation to any situation in your life, and then now top it with money and legal documents. It can get pretty squirrely.
And it gets bad, and you see this sometimes too, because when somebody knows that mom or dad's about to die, things get interesting. All of a sudden, a daughter that hasn't been around for 10 years is the caretaker for the last 6 months, and somehow dad has a change of heart during the last month to, leave that daughter more, let's say, and it's not that it can't happen or anything, but it just, all this stuff starts to raise suspicion. So, you see that from time to time.
These are the little badges that you're seeing.
These are things that happen, right? So,
So with that, I mean, and that was actually where I was going to kind of ask about this. I mean, what are some of the things that you see in these types of situations? I guess let's get into kind of the ugly stuff. So maybe, hopefully, if somebody's listening to this, they can maybe avoid that or take some precautions to get away from it. But what are some of the kind of the standard ugly things that you see rear their heads in these types of situations? And then what have you seen either people do or not do, to really mitigate some of this stuff and save a lot of heartache for these families and everybody that's involved.
Yeah, what I would say is, and obviously I can't get too specific because I can't reveal, a specific, I can't have people tie it together to meet a client. Then I'd be in a lot of trouble with the bar, as you might imagine.
No, keep it as high level.
What I would say is this. A lot of times people like to, when they draft wills themselves, or, a lot of times when somebody's trying to get dad to sign a will to give them everything, they'll go pick up a document that they can print out online or find some service that'll give it to them, and then they'll fill out the document, and they'll have, mom or dad sign that, and that'll be a problem. And you see that, I don't know if I see it a lot or anything, but it's definitely, when that happens, it's just asking. It's asking for a will contest. It really is. Because who's facilitating this? Who's there when, it's called, the person that signs a will, for example, is called a testator. Who is there, or testatrix? Who's there when the testator signs the document? I mean, there's so many questions that arise when you see a situation like that. And I know that, I think we were talking before we got going, attorneys, we are expensive, but there's a reason, particularly for estate planning attorneys, why we may charge what we charge. It's because we're trying to do it right. I would also say that we're fortunate in Southwest Florida to have such a good community of estate planning attorneys that a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about and the precautions that I take, they all take as well. So, when you have an attorney that drafts an estate plan, they're typically going to attempt to take the actions that I've talked about. I mean, there's more than that, but they're to take the actions to mitigate the risk, and they do a very good job.
Sure.
From time to time, you'll see a situation, and I think this happens in all practice areas, where an attorney, maybe they're doing something for their friend or something like that, and it's not really in their practice area, and they're like, oh, I can draft a will, or something. And it's not that they don't talk to the client or anything, but maybe they have the daughter in that scenario sitting there, and, it's just something like that. And it just, that's where, mistakes can be made. And, it's why, most of the time attorneys try to stay in their lane with what they do. But that's what I would see. The other thing I would say in trust litigation cases is, a lot of the time when let's say that I want to settle or create a trust, and I would be the settler of the trust. And it's my revocable trust, so I'm the trustee of the trust during my life, and I can do whatever I want with the assets. But when I die, I name, let's say my wife. Now this isn't true of me, but let's say that I'm on a second marriage and I have kids from the first marriage, and I decide that I want to leave my trust, and I want my wife to get income for the trust for her life, and I want her to be able to make distributions to herself because she's the trustee for her health, education, maintenance, and support. But when I die, the trust is irrevocable. Okay. Now, when I name the wife as the trustee of the trust, a lot of the time they read the trust and they don't seek legal counsel. Okay. So they read it and they're like, oh, I got this. I got it. No problem. And they administer the trust for several years, and they're not providing accountings to all the trust beneficiaries. So that would be, and just let me backtrack a second. Imagine this trust gives income to my wife for life, and it allows her to make those distributions that I was talking about. But when she dies, then everything that's left over goes to my kids. Okay. So she would have a responsibility. There's various duties that a trustee has. A duty of loyalty, and is a huge one, obviously, but one of them is a duty to inform an account. And that requires that every single year the trustee has to provide a trust accounting to all of what's called the qualified beneficiaries, which in this case would be not only my wife, but it would also be my kids. Now, let's say that she thinks she can manage the trust by herself. She has no idea that, the Florida Trust Code, and particularly Florida Statute 7360813, I think this is how often we do it, because this is a number. Yeah. Believe me, when you're suing for a breach of trust, accounting is one of the quickest things that comes to mind, okay, because they just haven't provided you with the information. And then you do that for a few years, and you think, because what happened, and I've seen this situation happen many times actually, where the wife thinks, based on her reading of the trust, that she can basically do whatever she wants with what's in the trust the same way as her husband was, because that's what he was doing, and she can get income and she can make distributions for her health, education, maintenance, and support, without realizing that she can't make distributions for whatever she wants. And not only can she not make distributions for whatever she wants, it has to be confined to health, education, maintenance, and support, but she also has to provide these trust accountings, okay? In that context, maybe the children a couple of years down the road are like, why haven't we heard anything about the trust? Maybe one of them has an attorney friend, or maybe one of them just says, maybe we'll have an attorney look at this to make sure things are going correctly. Well, then what you have happen is they go into an attorney that's like, well, it's been 4 years. Have you not gotten an accounting? No. Well, she was supposed to provide you with an accounting. oh, we don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the attorney's like, okay, well, this is something that I can do. We can, file a lawsuit to either remove her as trustee or at least get an accounting from her and make her account for all the stuff that's happened over the 4 years. Now imagine if you get that lawsuit as the wife and you thought everything was good. I mean, you had a good faith belief that everything was, you were managing the trust correctly, but you didn't. Well, and number one, you're now going to have to go hire an attorney and retain them. And number two, now you have to go back through those distributions and ask the question, well, is this really for my maintenance and support? Most trusts have certain limitations or certain language that talks about the support and maintenance, and it says something like, a lot of the times, that it's in the accustomed standard of living of that person. Well, if you took more than your accustomed, if you live on X amount of dollars and now you took X amount plus or double of what X is, and also a trip to Europe for 2 months, well, you might start having a little bit of problems that you took some out. And I double that back to, my estate planning, because a lot of the times you want to have a frank conversation with your client. Do you really want to leave the spouse in control of the situation? And that may just depend on the amount of funds that are actually there, the manner that you're distributing the assets, whether you're going to actually keep it in trust or distribute it outright.
Sure.
Or whether you have an available person that you trust as the trustee in that context to do it. And also at the same time, just, what I would advise anyone that becomes the trustee is at least have a consultation with an attorney to have some kind of idea that you know what you're doing before you make a mistake. So those are a couple of examples, I would say.
That seems like, that last thing seems like the way to go, even just to know what you've got going on in that document. Because, especially as a non-legal person, I think my mom is probably the closest person to an attorney who's not an attorney, but she loves that legal language and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But as somebody that doesn't know it, it's pretty difficult to navigate through that stuff. So even just knowing, I don't know what the boundaries are, what the guidelines are, and what rules you're playing with can save a lot of issues. Because in that case, it seems like if you had the wife, maybe she is the mother, or maybe she's the wife and the kids are from a
or maybe both. Maybe you have a mixed situation, which can be even more difficult. Right?
Sure. So if you're in that situation, it goes from the dad passed away and it's all really sad, but we kind of keep it copacetic, to all of a sudden within maybe 2 or 3 days, you're like bitter enemies, and a lot of issues rise up, especially if you're talking about tens, hundreds, thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. People act real strange around that stuff, even for no money. I won't say no money, but people do act weird for no money. But I know somebody who's her dad passed away, and her dad had a house and had some money, but he left her as the trustee. But the two uncles, his brothers, kind of came in and said, we're going to help take care of this. And then, boom, the day he died or day after he died, all of the money in the account that was there, I don't know, maybe $80,000 or $100,000 or something like that, was just gone.
Yep, that happens. The change of beneficiary, or the creation and or change of beneficiary designations on like an insurance policy or a 401k or an IRA, or just a brokerage account, or, titling a checking or a savings account jointly, because there's a presumption under Florida law that passes automatically to the person at death, is also, we were talking about examples before, and I was really thinking about kind of in line with some of the documents that I was at, but those are other examples of things that lead to litigation all the time. And, it's a lot of it's the same kind of standard when I was talking about undue influence before. If you're the one that takes them and drives them to the bank, and you're the one that goes up there with them when you talk to the teller and all that stuff, it's the same type of badges that you can also see. But yeah, you see this stuff happen. Like you said, it's because I don't know what it, I guess I can't reach into the mind of people that do this, but a lot of times people get nervous and anxious when somebody's going to die, and sometimes I think they just go too far, to be honest. That's probably looking at them and giving them the benefit of the doubt. But in reality, there's an advantage to be taken, and it happens a lot, and it's unfortunate, but that's why we have courts, right?
Yeah.
So,
do you ever like ponder these questions? When you get home after dealing with some of this stuff and seeing, hopefully you don't see it too often, but sometimes when people kind of go this this darker route. Does that philosophy ever start popping back into your mind? And
I don't know, maybe a little. I don't know. What I would say is, if we can talk a little bit of political philosophy.
Sure.
And one of the coolest things about probate that I think is you'll remember the Magna Carta in your historical studies, probably as a kid, right?
Yeah,
one of the first written it was so long ago or whatever. And I have been told, because I don't read Latin, and maybe I'm about to say something that is, it's going to be fake news, but I've been told, and I've actually looked into it a little bit, that a lot of the issues, obviously, that the I guess I don't know if they were lords or barons or whatever they were, but
sure.
essentially I think won a war more or less against the king, and basically sit around him going, "You're going to sign this, or else that's the end of you being the king." A lot of it was related to inheritance rights, believe it or not. Now, not inheritance rights for everyone, because you have all of the
serfs,
the peasants and the serfs and the slaves, probably. I mean, I don't know if England, the mainland. I mean, I know that slavery was legal back during that time, but I don't know exactly what it was like. But the people that weren't
serfdom is pretty close.
The best of the if you weren't a duke, then you probably didn't apply to you. But one of the things was that was something that was actually considered there, and I think that as part of the Western tradition, generally, we've looked at property rights and kind of looked at that with the various freedoms that we have. It's just fortunate that now that applies more universally, at least. I mean, obviously, not everyone has necessarily the same means or anything like that, but at least the idea of the right being there applies to everyone like that. And at some level, when we talk about probate and we talk about estate planning, and even tax planning at some level, I mean, really what you're trying to do is protect the client's property and their rights in that context. I mean, you want to make sure, it's the last thing they do. It's the very last thing that they do. Maybe not, they don't sign the will, but the last expression of what they want to have happen to the things that they have is giving the property to their kids, their spouse, their friends, the charities that they're interested in. And that's important. That's important to them. And you're seeing that through. I mean, that's really ultimately what you're doing. And at some level, that's pretty good. As far as from a moral sense, I mean, goodness, when anyone that acts in that manner, I mean, look, we all have our shortcomings, to say the least, I would say, but that's kind of a big one, right, to do that. And I think the reason that's kind of, we'll say, messed up is, I mean, if you have a parent or a friend or a relative, I mean, I'm assuming, like in your example, the uncles were at least some level close with their brother, and it just seems like to change their brother's wishes when they probably knew what they were is, that's a pretty rough way to go. I think that's particularly true. I mean, you'll see this situation, and it's even more sad, where the kid is a minor and you're almost disinheriting them because you're so selfish and greedy. I mean, that's sad, but
have you seen that before?
I don't
know if you're allowed.
I've seen. I haven't seen what I directly describe, but but I've seen other things generally. Let's just say that are somewhat related to minors, and it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Okay.
Yeah, It's weird. It makes you kind of like question, people's ability to kind of dive into the depths of evil.
Yeah.
I guess you kind of see it even when you look at some of these like child slavery things or child soldiers and stuff like that. I mean, maybe it's just because the whole
I can't
world
understand.
Is different,
it doesn't, at the risk of just becoming, I don't know, we'll just say it like it is. I can't understand for the life of me why anyone would do anything to harm children at all. There's a million different things that happen, and you read stories about it from time to time. And the Supreme Court of the United States, when they interpret the cruel and unusual punishment clause, they've generally, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and let me just look at the audience here. This entire thing is for informational purposes only. I'm not talking about your situation or your case,
this message
et
is
cetera,
not
et cetera.
condoned by
And I mean that.
Merriman Law
And I'm definitely not a constitutional lawyer, but I did take con law. And my understanding of the law when it comes to cruel and unusual punishment, and particularly with the death penalty, is basically you have to kill somebody to get the death penalty. And there was a case that was actually decided where one of the states in the South passed a law that basically said that if you, I guess we're going to go here, but that if you commit sexual assault on someone under the age of 12, you could get the death penalty. And the court said that was cruel and unusual punishment and struck it down. I think that's a terrible decision, to be honest, because to me, there are situations where I don't want to make a general statement too much, but to me, that is as horrendous, if not more horrendous, than many murders that may be committed. I mean, maybe not. At least they're at such a level of evil that it's beyond the scope of what should be tolerated in an acceptable society. I don't know which one is worse in a circumstance, but if you could get convicted of essentially, I don't know, raping a child, you got to go.
Yeah, dude.
I mean, that's kind of the way I look at it when it comes to somebody. Or if there's someone that's got to go, that's the person that's got to go. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Because some people are absolutely against the death penalty, okay? And I understand there's I'm sure people have moral issues with it, and what's the purpose of the penal code? Is it about retribution? Is it about trying to fix people, and stuff like that? And I believe it's about justice, and I think that if you rape a child, then you got to go.
You got to go, dude.
But the Supreme Court said no, and that's one of the decisions. I remember reading that in law school, going, that is just, I don't know. And when the Supreme Court says that, nobody can do it, right? So 50 states passed a law tomorrow, it is what it is. But you brought up, things, whether it's that or child slavery, or, you're talking about, I guess at some level, trafficking, any of that stuff. It's like, if you're involved in that, man, you got to go. I know that's a harsh way of saying it and everything, but that's just something that should never be tolerated in our society under any circumstances whatsoever. And every time I read a story about it, it's just so sad. And you see the stuff, and however, I don't know, however you feel about, like, let's say our border or something. I read a story the other day that I think they said a third of the children that have come across the border, they don't know where they are. And I'm imagining that's what they said, okay? I don't know. I saw it on multiple outlets and stuff like that, but assuming that story is somewhat true, I hate to think this way, but if you have people that are involved in some kind of child sex trafficking, it seems like it would not be an illogical conclusion to draw that, it's not like they're finding these children's bodies anywhere, like they're gone, so it would seem to me that if you wanted to, I don't know, find a bunch of children that you tell their parents you're going to get them to America and they're going to be okay, that's a way to go about it. And I hope that's not the case. I really hope that nothing like that is what's happening down there. But I fear that I fear that stuff. And that's the stuff that really, that's the stuff that pisses me off more than anything. It's the stuff that applies to children. And it's like that with everything that we look at in the way that we live our lives, whether it's our culture, our government and everything, just thinking about our children, the next generation, and the consequences of everything we do now and what that actually entails. Because a lot of the time, I guess I'm still fairly young, so a lot of the consequences of what happens today I'll have to bear, but our children are definitely going to have to bear it, and our grandchildren are definitely going to have to bear it. And it seems like we at some level have lost sight of that. So,
yeah. Well, and there too, it's like, with the border situation, you are dealing with cartels, and they are sending people over, as like mules and things like that.
They are.
So it's, dude, that stuff's sketchy. I can't understand. Especially with like philosophy and things like that, you do try to get into the minds of other people or the psyches of other people sometimes, but man, that's one that I can't wrap my head around.
I can't wrap my head around it either. I don't know. And you see that, and there's been a lot of horrors throughout history. You see them a lot. When you go back and see, I've heard, look, I'm not a historian or anything like that. I'm somebody that listens to a lot of podcasts, let's say. Never been on one, It's like those callers that are like long-time listener, long-time first-time, or first-time caller, long-time listener. I feel like that on the podcast. But I don't know if you ever listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History.
Dude, yeah. I haven't listened to most, but the one on World War I, that's one of my favorites.
I agree with you 100%. Because we always look back. It's like we look back to World War II, but you don't realize the viciousness of World War I and the idea that they didn't really know, like when you have automatic weapons and then you learn how to build trenches, and the idea that they were constantly sending people to advance, and they were just getting mowed down on both sides. And then, as Dan Carlin pointed out, he goes, how long do you have to do this? Like, before you realize maybe we shouldn't just send people over the edge to die. And they just continued to do it.
Well, that's why they called Haig the Butcher, because he would just send the British forces over and just...
and it wasn't until, I believe it wasn't until they developed tanks that it really made a difference in that war. Mm-hmm. But another one that he did was he was talking about Genghis Khan. And if you want to listen to one, it's unbelievable. And he talks, and I don't know if these numbers are right. I don't know if we're talking secondhand and third hand, because it's not like Genghis Khan was, a lot of people wrote history about him. I think a lot of it was the Chinese because he would invade. But they were talking about scenarios where he would walk into a town and he'd be like, okay, surrender now or everyone dies. Mm-hmm. And if they didn't surrender, everyone died. Everyone. Okay, maybe I think he was very good at taking like the warriors and stuff like that and ask them if they wanted to come in. But the general thing was he would send his entire army out and say, go kill everyone, or at least more or less everyone. And that's what would happen. Yeah. Now, I'm sure they kept some people for things like slaves or spouses, I'm sure, or something like that. But other than that, they killed everyone. And so there have been horrendous things that have happened. I think the difference is when something happens in the Western culture, just based on where it's adapted from and the morality that we've developed over the last, let's say just since the Renaissance, but you could probably go back even further than that. It kind of shocks the conscious. I think that's why the Holocaust shocked the conscious so much, is because we thought we were a modern society. People didn't, even the Germans didn't do that. They didn't do that. And that's what was so hard, and that was what's so unbelievable about a story like that. And that was after World War I, where we thought we just thought we were a different society altogether. And to see that level of, what was it, 10 million people, 6 million Jews, something like that died. That's what was so hard to understand. And I think it's obviously not a good thing that any of that stuff happens, but I think it's at some level we should appreciate the society we live in, that everybody universally recognizes something like that as evil and as bad. Yeah. That means that we have certain standards that we have in the West, which is why when we look at things like child trafficking, we know that that's a really I want to use the F word there.
Yeah, you can curse on here, dude.
Can we curse on here? It is, and there's no other way to describe it. That stuff is just totally fucked up. Mm-hmm. Okay, totally. And there's no other way to describe it. So, I hope, I don't know. I know that. Yeah. I hope we have the if there's anything in the world we could have resources for our government, anything, I would hope that we allocate plenty of resources to that, because I'm pretty sure it's probably a very difficult thing to combat. It's terrible. So
yeah, if you listen to any interviews with some of the guys that do that kind of combating, and they go out and they stop these child trafficking rings and all that stuff, man, it sounds like horror stories. And too, it's like one of those things is, if that's something that you get involved in, is you are bringing some heavy darkness into your life, into your family's life, all that kind of stuff. So it's really not for the faint of heart. But man, even you hear it's like Fort Myers has like a big piece of child trafficking. It's like a huge thing, apparently.
You hear it, and it's just like, I don't know.
It's like, how?
That's what I'm looking at too. It's like, how does someone even? How? Where? And you're just like, apparently, but like, who are these people that number one are interested in children, and number two, how would you even? And I'm not asking, it's crazy to me. Like, how would you even, who approaches the person to try to get somebody plugged into something as messed up as that? Yeah. Like, without somebody coming, I don't know if I found out about that, but like, all right, like, what's the number to the police right now to tell that this person said something to me, or that I found out this person was engaged in that, because that's what I would do, at least to give them, maybe you should watch this guy, right? Something like that. I don't understand this stuff. But that to me is anything with children, even selling drugs to children, sex trafficking with children, anything that children do not have the ability to consent. As they get older, they start to, but a lot of the times we're talking about kids. We're not talking about teenagers. We're talking about children. Yeah. And that stuff is just, that is not, it is unbelievable to me.
Well, and when you look at, so have you ever heard of something called the Franklin scandal?
I've not.
So this was one of those things that you hear that really, it was one of the fundamental things, maybe 2.5, 3 years ago, somewhere in that zone, where I really started looking at the world differently, maybe a little bit more jaded, or just not believing all of the things that you're told, maybe from the main narratives. But so there was the basic summary, and I don't know everything about it, but there's basically a credit union in Omaha, Nebraska in the late 80s that this guy ran. His name was Larry King. He's not the the radio host, but another guy named Larry King.
He had a second career.
This is his shadow career. But he ran this credit union that actually was a front for like a child trafficking ring, and they would bring all of these different kids from that area in Omaha. And there's a place called Boys Town. It was for like, I guess, at-risk youth type thing, but just they would kind of recruit kids from there, or recruit kids that didn't really have like strong family ties and things like that. And they'd ended up getting them into like sex rings in that area. And then once they were kind of bought in enough, they'd start like literally flying them on chartered planes to New York, to DC, to Sacramento, all of these different places throughout the country, having them meet with like top members of the political parties. And they would, according to these kids, that went through this, they would like sexually abuse them and do all this stuff. And there was just entire rings around this. And then, then the Epstein stuff starts coming out.
The Epstein, it sounds a little bit like the Epstein stuff. I don't know if Epstein, I believe most of that. Look, I didn't watch the documentary on Netflix. I believe we're talking about definitely underage girls, but I don't know if they were like children, like 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. But it doesn't make it right. But I'm just saying, like the kid stuff is just. All of it's awful.
But what defense do you have? Oh yeah, I'm just bringing these kids to a private island on a jet. Nothing fishy going on.
Yeah, we don't have any weird cultish rituals or anything like that going on this private island or anything like that. It's all that stuff's very weird. And the way, talking specifically, what you're saying, that stuff's insane. But like, it's just kind of one of those things. It's like, but you don't know. And I think the thing that's happened more recently, and I don't know why, but it just seems like a lot of the things that seemed conspiratorial before, there's just certain things that come out here and there, and you're like, wait, maybe that's not as much of a conspiracy as people act like it is. Not to say most of it still isn't or anything like that, but you see things and you hear things, and you're just like, wait a second, it gives you pause when it comes to stuff, particularly on that issue right there, because that seems like it's a very weird thing. And you saw it with Epstein too, because, look, that guy was tied into every top player on political parties, giant corporations,
scientists,
everything.
Everybody.
I read news reports that one of the reasons Melinda Gates wanted to divorce Bill Gates is about how closely he was associated with him. You see that with Clinton, how many times he went over there.
Did not fly on that plane.
Yeah, it's just... and it's just, you're looking at this going like, and then this guy goes to jail and everybody's like, he's going to die in there. Yeah. And then he does. And then everyone's like, oh, all right. Like, it just goes away. And it's like, all right, I guess. And he's also, got the I guess Prince Andrew was one of his buddies too, or something like that. I don't know what the hell was going on there. But it's just like all of a sudden we things happen and then they're around for a little bit and then they just kind of go away and there's no closure. I was thinking about that the other day. Remember the gunman in Las Vegas that killed, I don't remember how many, 40, 60 people, something like that, but just indiscriminately shooting it to concert goers. What happened there? Like, now we don't know. We just know that happened, and apparently they went in the door and they killed him, and it's just some guy, and nobody ever came out with a report that I know of that said this is why this happened or anything like that. It's just this guy did this thing, and that's it. And it was, I don't know, that just seemed very that there's just things like that happen from some time, but it just lasts until the next thing. It just lasts until the next thing, like, and no one ever really follows up, and no one ever really has any accountability when it comes to stuff like that. Not to go in a different direction, but we're down this road this far.
Let's do it.
But like with what happened in Afghanistan, right? It's just, and a lot of the issue that people talk about are, you could look at whether it was a good idea to withdraw or not withdraw or anything, but there's a proper mechanism to do it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Now, I think that 95% of the people, maybe there's some people that just won't agree, but think that there's probably a better mechanism that we could have done that, where, I don't know, you pull civilians, at least American civilians, and to the extent possible, the people that have helped us before, the military, before giving up air bases, et cetera, just generally speaking.
Yeah.
But the problem I'm having when I analyze that is kind of, okay, they've more or less admitted that it was a problem. They've said things like, well, the intelligence community said that it was going to last to the end of the year. Okay, well, who'd you fire from the intelligence community that gave you bad intel? Right? Yeah. Okay, you're saying that at least, when our president says that he says it was unanimous from his advisors to do it that way.
Who's advising him?
Like, well, number one, who's advising him? And number two is, okay, when are you going to ask for their letter of resignation, right? Because and the thing is, because I'm looking at this going, obviously we have a huge foreign policy crisis that I think will last. I'm not a foreign policy expert, but I also know that Parliament, I think they held Biden in contempt, and they've never done that with an American president before, because he didn't even like our military did not let the British military, who was our partners and our NATO partners, they fought alongside us in Afghanistan, and didn't even let them know. And then when we left, they had to withdraw their troops. Didn't even let them know that we were doing it, and they were pissed, and I mean almost to a man in British Parliament. They held Biden in contempt, and you see stuff like that happen, and you're just like, what the hell is going on here? It's just.
And when you hear and so this is part of my thing when I hear things like this Franklin scandal and the Epstein stuff and these kind of people that are in these powerful positions and doing all this stuff, you start to realize, okay, I really actually don't understand how any of this stuff really works. How it's being portrayed is not really how it is. Like, you look at that, and a regular person goes, that was botched. You see the people running on the airfield, people trying to hang onto the planes, falling off, like a horror scene. Like, if that was me and like I had my kids there or something like that, like I could imagine that would be maybe the most horrific experience of your life, knowing that the Taliban is pretty close and things probably aren't going to end well for you. But like, it makes my cynical side is like, dude, they've been there for how many years? They said they've been planning to do this for a long time. Like, was this botched as a way just to go like, oh, well, it looks like we can't leave, Like,
that's actually interesting. And I know there's a lot of people that think that maybe it was intentionally botched to go back in. I don't know. Because is that what you're thinking about generally?
At this point,
it could not have been botched worse.
At this point, I basically don't trust most of the leadership that's in this country. It has nothing to do really with like, oh my God, I hate
the Democrats, I hate the Republicans. Yeah. Like, no,
it's like literally
there's a ruling class.
Yeah, and it totally is becoming more and more transparent, and like.
Well, they also try to see what they get away with.
Well, yeah.
It's almost like every now and then you see something come out and you're just like, it's like, are they just trying to see what they can get away with at a certain level? You see that, well, another thing, just to go back, one of the things you actually pointed out, as far as like leaving and people knowing where they're going to leave, I think the biggest problem that the Afghani people had, or the American citizens there, were that Biden was coming out a month before saying something to the effect of, it'll take the Taliban at least till the end of the year to
like regroup
to be able to go through Afghanistan. When he was at the same time having conversations with the president of Afghanistan, telling him, no matter whether it's true or not, we need you to say that things are going well. Okay. And I think that was reported in the Washington Post that he had a phone call with them, and there's they have a leaked transcript or an audio or something like that. And my point is, if you're in Afghanistan as an American and your president is saying, dude, it's going to take a long time, you might not be running on the first plane back. I mean, a lot of these people, I think because we had a partnership at some level with the, former, I should say, Afghani government. A lot of these people are going to college in America. They're going home to see their parents. Literally, that's what you see with a lot of these situations. And if they're like, oh, you have at least till the end of the year, they might go, okay, well, I'm going to stay for a few weeks until I have to go back to school, or maybe I'll stay till the end of September or whatever it is. And when something gets botched like that, it's bad. And it's particularly bad when I think they had intelligence that indicated something a little bit different, or else he wouldn't have had to have that type of phone call. But you make a good point with, trusting people generally. It's like, and it's not just in the United States. I mean, Australia, I don't know if you've seen their COVID lockdown. It's insane. They will allow their citizens to go out for 1 to 2 hours of recreational activity if they're vaccinated. And I've never been to prison before, but I'm pretty sure that sounds a little bit like, okay, you get 1 hour outside. You know what I mean? I mean,
that's back in your house.
Yeah,
we're gonna put you in jail.
And you're like looking at that, and I think they did that after they had like 7 confirmed cases or something extraordinarily low. And you're just like, I don't know, because I've always had this idea that like, look, everybody wants to be safe, and we all want to be protected as much as possible. But we have to have some level of liberty. We have to have some level of freedom, and there is a price to be paid when you sacrifice that.
Yeah.
And it's not a good, and no one has the answer to everything. No one does. But it's as if we just want our government to have all the answers, and just to follow that blindly sometimes And when they get it wrong so many times, it doesn't mean they're wrong in that particular instance, but it's like have a little bit of prudence, have a little bit of, I don't know, reflection's not the right word, but investigate that a little bit more, and don't just blindly trust, because and even with that, it's just like we have to value liberty. We have to, because it's such an important thing in and of itself, and you have to put that, you have to have that idea, the idea of freedom, the idea of liberty, compete with whatever measures are going to be taken, right? You can't just say, well, this measure will protect. Okay, well, outlawing tractor trailers on the road or SUVs would go, or lowering the speed limit to 25 miles an hour might stop the thousands of deaths that we have on the highway, right? There's other things too, for adults. I know some of this is cut out, but there's questions about recreational drug use and the ability of that. What about alcohol? And we have the freedom to drink, even though, you could make an argument that alcohol is, as intoxicating and puts people in more bad situations than other recreational drugs. And my point isn't that I have an opinion on any of that stuff, or that I'm an authority figure on any of that stuff, because I definitely am not. It's more just saying, look, freedom matters, and it particularly should matter in this country a little bit more than everywhere else, considering that's what we're founded on. And respecting an individual's right to make the individual decision for himself and his family. That's everything. And that's what our country is founded on. And it troubles me more than anything else. And this happens on both sides. Although from a governmental standpoint, right now, there's one side that's in more power, I guess, and able to make those decisions. But just the idea that if you disagree, not only that the lack of understanding that other people can disagree with you, and the forceful nature in which you have to demand conformity. And that's the kind of stuff where it's like, are you just doing it now? It doesn't matter what it is. I have to conform with what it is that you're telling me to do, because that becomes very problematic in a number of ways for our country. And that could be as damaging to our country as anything else that's going on, because, it's so divided, and, I don't think
Well, and plus a lot of that stuff, it really, if you just look historically, like going super forcefully down any route that's like that has led to, I hate to sound like a dramatic here, but if you look at like the Soviet Union over the course of, however long it was, around 60 or 70 years, you're talking anywhere from low estimates of 10 million deaths to 50 million deaths just by taking that kind of logic and really like putting the throttle all the way forward. It can be really dangerous.
People. They killed like 6 million Ukrainians back in the 50s or something. I don't know the year or whatever.
It never happened.
Yeah, it never happened. Well, and the thing is too, you do have people, in certain movements and certain walks of life in the United States that are sympathetic to this stuff. And, it's like you mentioned Russia or the Soviet Union, but think about communist China, where they estimated between 50 and 100 million. And they were and the first people they went after were people that were intelligent, right? The people that would dissent with any intelligible argument against them. That's who they got rid of first, of course, because you can't have any dissent. And the lack of dissent's problematic, and it's problematic. And I think the thing is too, because a lot of times when you have this argument about, the tech giants, when you talk about Facebook, when you talk about YouTube and Google, and when you talk about Twitter and censorship and stuff like that, my biggest, I understand they're private industries and stuff like that, and that's the thing, well, they're private industries, but that's not my frustration. My frustration is that culturally, we used to have the understanding that free speech was a good thing, period. Okay? That if you had a better idea, you should win the argument. You don't have to silence someone else. And in fact, silencing someone else, maybe it's the cynic in me, it tends to make me think that maybe they had something good to say if you're going to silence them, or else why would you do that? I think it was, going back to philosophy, I think it was John Stuart Mill that talked about that, and I'm going to paraphrase here a lot, but he specifically talked about the marketplace of ideas and how great it is when you have a bad idea to have someone correct you. And that's not even an availability in a situation where you don't have freedom to do that. And my point with Facebook, it's not about what, you can argue whether or not that when Congress basically tells the tech giants, hey, you need to censor this stuff or we're going to regulate you, and then they go and censor it, whether that's a government action such that maybe it does violate the First Amendment, that's one question. That's not my bigger point. My bigger point is, when in the United States of America did we think that it wasn't a good idea for people to speak freely? When did we think it was a good idea to cancel people that are like 27 years old working at a magazine, okay? that in this case, you know, I don't know the names of it, but like super liberal now, okay? And the left comes after them because they said something when they were 14 years old on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's just crazy to me. And it's just like, this is insane. There's no perspective. And we have a lot of people in our country that somehow think that right now they just have it all figured out, that they don't make any mistakes, and that they're like the elect. And they know everything about everyone, and anyone that doesn't conform to that is just wrong. And anyone that's ever done anything bad in their entire past that doesn't conform to present-day standards is awful. And that's why we tear down statues of Thomas Jefferson, even though without the Declaration of Independence, we don't have freedom to the slaves that were currently, that later came. I mean, one thing leads into another over history, and people don't have any perspective over that. It's like, yes, you know, for example, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. But yes, do you know that the Declaration of Independence led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is what, I don't know, Haiti based their initial, I shouldn't even say Haiti, that led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France, which during the French Revolution is what led to the freedom of slaves in Haiti. And you want to know why? Because it's people identify that something like the Declaration of Independence and the idea that man in and of itself, and women, but man in and of itself has something valuable that's innate in them. Such an equality of man means necessarily that you can't have slavery. Yeah. It's just that at the time that you're writing something like this, slavery has existed forever, not for 100 years, forever in every civilization that's ever existed. And you take something like that, and you have to realize that not only in that context, it was the most liberal position on that issue that you could theoretically have had, right? And to go back and not see the stepping stones that something like that takes to change something that was, man did not exist without, in any iteration, in any civilization, without the idea of slavery or serfs or something that was virtually the equivalent of something like that. It didn't really exist. Maybe you could find bits and pieces of it somewhere in places, and maybe that wasn't even an acceptable, maybe it wasn't what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't something that, let's say, made sense within the context of that society.
Sure.
Of course, it's going to take stepping stones to get rid of that. But that only happens when you value the individual and understand the equality that each individual has. And we are getting away from that so fast now on so many different levels that everything that we've built is just crumbling. And it's, you know, and there's, you know.
Well, and if you look at those like ideals, right? If you look where they stem from, I'm actually reading a book about where the founding fathers got their philosophy from in Greek philosophy. And it's kind of crazy to see the lengths of time that this goes and skips 1700 years, and then somebody finds it later and reads it. But it is interesting to see where these things, like you said, open the door for future, you know, generations, future groups of oppressed people to take these same ideas and kind of flip it back on the group that, yes, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and then there was this entire power structure. But if you look at like Martin Luther King's speech, he actually quotes part of the Constitution, which Jefferson wrote like a majority of that. But he takes those same ideals that help these people get free and turns it around and points it back at them and goes, I think hey, you got to live up to this same standard that you said that you were creating for all people. And I think that's where you get, and I'm speaking way out of school here, but I think that's where you get a movement like the civil rights movement to say like, yeah, you know what? That is true. Like, we are equal. We're regular people. We shouldn't be treated less than this. What do you have to say about our challenge, asking you the same questions that your forefathers asked of the British? And I think it's really cool to see all of those ideas like flow through time, and you really do get to see the end result of it. I know we do have, I think in America right now we have a lot less people-to-people racism than we used to 40, 50, 60 years ago. I think for sure. I think the systemic stuff is still in place, you know, to what extent.
Can you pause for a second?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry. My wife's called me like a bunch of times.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I'm sorry to interrupt or everything like that, but I saw my phone ring a couple of times.
That's all right.
And that is an important call, though.
Dude,
right?
when
the wife calls twice back to back and you're just like, wait a second, because you never know what might have happened. You got to be available. Is the house
on fire? Is somebody die? Is everything okay?
Right.
Yeah.
So I totally got it.
Yeah, dude, I would do the same. So
yeah. So I think you were talking about Dr. King there, and I think he used the term something like America wrote a promissory note that it hasn't delivered on yet or something like that when it came to them. And he's absolutely right.
Yeah,
and
dude.
the civil rights movement is a great movement because it was based on the same principles that our founding was based on. Those principles are good. They are good.
Yeah.
And that's what I was talking about before. Like when we look at certain things that happen in our society, we're able to look at it and say that it's bad. The reason we're able to say it's bad is because we have standards. Those standards are oftentimes reflected in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and in the constitutional amendments that have come after that. What it's not in is a lot of the stuff that we have now where people want to silence everyone else, and they basically want to go backwards on things like race and like gender and like just generally equality of the individual. And that's the bigger thing. It's not just equality. It's equality of the individual person, okay? And evaluating somebody through the lens of the individual. That's something that the West did better than any other society, and it's why we're productive, is because we didn't hold the sins of your father against you, the sins of your group against you. We tried not to, and understand that racism exists, and it'd be difficult to imagine that if the Chinese marched an army over here and slaughtered half the country, for us to view any Chinese person, if we went through something like that, without suspicion. Okay, I'm not pretending that there aren't things like that exist, but my point is there was always an attempt to evaluate somebody as an individual and evaluate and have grace with that person and prudence with that person. And generally, not that we could ever do this in our society anymore, but giving people the benefit of the doubt over what they say and do. I think that'd be productive.
And I think right now too, if you're talking to people like on the street for the most part, the average person that you meet, everybody's like pretty cool, for the most part. Well, I don't really know many people. I maybe can go, I'm sure I could find some people, especially, being in Florida, but, there's not many people that I know that are even like remotely racist or say like things like that are pretty fucked up. Once you get over a certain age, it's like, what did you think your grandparents thought? Have you ever heard that Bill Burr joke? Like when he's talking
Donald
about like,
Sterling?
Yeah, he's like, what did you think he thought?
Yeah, he's 83 years old. Yeah, and you're like, and he said he lived too long. He said that was his greatest sin, was living too long. But there's truth to that, though. That's what we're talking about. You can't always evaluate someone using today's standards based on what was going on 50 years. They could be the most progressive person or the most liberal person. I mean liberal like in the sense of like libertarian, about like certain issues. Like nobody might have been okay, let's say, with 50 years ago, I think the idea of interracial marriage was not something that was looked upon very well by any race, actually, but by a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And now, but if you back in 50 years ago thought that was a good idea, now you're still probably a racist by today's standards, right? I mean, I'm just saying, maybe at some level in a way, but my point is society changes and our norms change and our values change on certain issues, and you can't always go back and evaluate somebody else on that issue.
But it's also like, it's I don't know that society feels necessarily this way versus the way that it's portrayed in the media. That's more my point.
You're right.
I think more people are pretty cool with each other, maybe more than ever before, especially with the internet and the fact that you can really go travel almost anywhere in the world. Like, well, not right now, but generally speaking, is the world is becoming much more of a connected place, and it's pretty cool to be able to meet people from all different places, all different walks of life, and in a lot of cases now, like, just show up somewhere in another country and you can be welcome there. You can pay money and be part of their economy. Like you can live those types of experiences. I mean, that's pretty cool. And I think a lot of people are kind of getting done with this, like the cancel culture and all this kind of stuff. At least I hope so. I could be looking through rose-colored glasses. It takes
a couple corporations to, have some balls and just say, no, we're not firing them. Go fuck off.
Yeah, like even at the beginning of COVID, did you see the guy that was at the Costco over in Fort Myers? Like somebody was following him with a phone, like videotaping him. My guess is looking at the spot that he was at, it was kind of near the checkout aisle. So my guess is that he wasn't wearing a mask. Somebody followed him around the whole loop saying, why aren't you wearing a mask? Why aren't you wearing a mask? Why aren't you wearing a mask? Who knows what else they were saying? But all you get to see is the guy flipping out at the end. And then you don't see the whole lead up. You don't see what this person was saying to him, aggravating him, when a stranger's following you, that's pretty like
and I think
physically daunting.
I think there's a universal truth.
But that guy got fired. Fortunately, he was in Florida, so a bunch of people were like, hey, come
that's the thing, come work for me and
Yeah.
everything like that. But, and I think there is one universal truth that points out, which is, and a lot of people may disagree with this, but you can say things and do things that, should get you an ass kicking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? A lot of times people think that's not true, but I think in certain situations it is. But I think you hit on a good point there, that a lot of the noise is from the media and a lot of it's from people on Twitter and stuff like that. I have tons of friends that are on different spectrums and everything like that. And I'm probably, I know based on some of the issues we've talked about, a lot of people that may be listening may assume certain things about me, and they're probably wrong on a number of issues when it comes to that, because I don't think any individual is, tied to a certain team and just that you have to agree with everything, at least when you talk to somebody like that. But there's no value for the media in that, because they need that. And there's no value for the political parties to do that too, because they have to drive the wedge into people in order to make sure that they secure the votes that they're going to get. Mm-hmm. But I do think when you talk to somebody, I had at my last job, there's another attorney that I worked with, and he was definitely, disagreed with me about a number of things on the big picture. But, but then we talk and talk and talk. We'd have discussions forever. But at the end of the discussion, if you wanted to call it the position that we arrived at when it came to a policy, we probably worked it out to a fairly reasonable conclusion and agreed on, when it actually came down to it, on 80 to 90% of things that happen. And I think that's true across the board. I think that, I don't even know what half of my friends believe or stuff like that. Some of them are apolitical. I don't care, because that's not what we're talking about. And I know that they're reasonable people that you can reach a conclusion on. And I think most people are like that. But somehow, when people get behind the Facebook and they get behind the Twitter, and it turns into a different direction. And I don't like the fact that a lot of the time what happens is you start to dehumanize people when you get away from them, when you're not sitting there across them. Because I guarantee you, when you talk about Twitter people that get on Twitter, if both of them were sitting at a table like this, they would choose their words a little bit more carefully with how they talk to somebody.
Conversation will be way different,
and
because
it would be better
of that physical barrier. I mean, if you say certain things like, yeah, man, there are going to be people out there that, kick your ass. It's what that saying is of like, oh, he's going to say that to the wrong person.
That's right. That's right. And I'm not saying that I would do anything like that or anything, but you just see these people that act a certain way, and I think they think there can never be any repercussions. And sometimes, you deserve it. Like if somebody, I don't know. I mean, you can think of situations where things are warranted. I'm not saying I don't know all the Costco incident, but you're probably right. They did it, and they cut the 5 seconds at the end.
Yeah, and the guy actually reacted pretty reasonably. I think he handled it pretty well. He goes, "Get back! You're threatening me. Like you're like something like I'm in danger." He didn't tell the guy like
I didn't watch it, but that's smart. That's smart.
Yeah, it was like, dude, what is the best way that you could handle a physical altercation? That still got fired. But the thing that is scary about the dehumanizing part is, like, when I look at that, and then having listened to the whole hardcore history thing on World War I, 6-part thing, all 3 hours long. Like,
what I mean,
the best.
It was unbelievable.
Oh,
I mean, I've listened to a lot of podcasts before, but that one was just unbelievable,
dude. And I think about that all the time. That was 100 years ago. Now maybe 106 years ago, something like that. That's not that long ago that all of these nations had all of these different tensions built up and these conflicts waiting to happen. And it did not take very long for the entire world, all of the world powers, to send millions each of their own population to be mercilessly fucking killed and slaughtered, all for the name of what?
Well, no. And
like,
I mean, and Europe has so
point?
much history when you go back to it too, because like the reason the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors is because in the Franco-Prussian War, when the Prussians came through and they basically more or less humiliated France. I think it was like the 1860s, although my dates are wrong because, I'm just remembering this from somebody else telling me this, right? But they made them sign a peace accord that was very humiliating to the French in the Hall of Mirrors. And people talk about the Treaty of Versailles being totally just so over the top against the Germans. And that's one of the reasons it was like that. And it also had its consequence. A lot of people think that the consequences of that and the I don't know if they're called sanctions or whatever, the remedies that were provided for in that, where Germany had to pay so much and do certain things, is what led to the rise of something like, the National Socialist movement,
Sure.
which was competing with the communist movement there, actually. That's where that stuff comes in. But you're right. I think that, look, I think there's good reasons to go to war. I mean, I think there's sometimes you have to go. World War I is a very tough question because the Germans were the aggressors in that war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were, but it wasn't like the Germans then were not Nazis. Okay, they were not Nazis, and it wasn't the Nazi Party, doing the Blitzkrieg and all that stuff. I mean, they did have a way that they wanted to go out there, but it was a completely different war. It was a completely different thing. And have you listened to the new ones that he has on Japan?
No.
It's on the World War II, but it just focuses on the Pacific Theater.
Okay.
Oh, it's brutal stuff.
Yeah.
It's brutal stuff. I think that I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I'll try to be as accurate as I can. In the Eastern Front, in the European War, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were taken, as prisoners of war. In the Pacific Theater, I should say the European Theater and Pacific Theater, I think that's what they call it. But in the Pacific Theater, it wasn't the front, because the front is like in Europe, there were two fronts, so it would be the European Theater and the Pacific Theater. In the Pacific Theater, I believe that I think we took less than 10 prisoners of war of the Japanese. They didn't surrender ever. And that thing was bloody over there. It wasn't the same. It was just something vicious. We were just talking about World War I, and it was just nasty, nasty stuff. And, and that's what war is. And I don't think we should ever lose sight of that, but I also think there's good reasons to go to war. I mean, in certain situations, you just got to find them. And you got to hope that when you go to war, you're given general objectives. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we made in Afghanistan is maybe initially we knew what the mission was, but then it kind of changed, right?
Yeah.
And then it, and you have to know exactly what you're over there for and why you're there. And I think that, and also, I mean, there's so many questions with Afghanistan too, because, during the last 18 months, we don't lose a soldier. We have 2,500 troops over there. And just with those 2,500 troops, maybe we had to bump it up a little bit. I don't know. It seems like that it was at least somewhat stable. And I hear our president talking about, what am I going to do? Send tens of thousands of more troops. But I think that's a straw man. I don't think that's actually what the argument was. I don't think that would ever be necessary. It's just something.
Sure.
Because I guess the question I have is, people are like, it's 20 years, it's America's longest war. And I'm like, well, what constitutes a war? Because, we're there for 20 years and we haven't taken significant casualties since really like 2014, where it's actually been active combat. And I think the troops that we had over there were non-combat troops. They were just support troops like, techs and stuff like that to help with the air power and stuff. Because I believe we trained the Afghan army to call in airstrikes. So when they didn't have the airstrike capability anymore, it's no wonder that they immediately crumbled. But notwithstanding that, it's like, okay, well, if the definition of war is having troops in an area, then the Korean War is not over yet, and World War II is not over yet. I mean, we still have troops in Japan, we have troops in Germany, we have troops in Korea, we have troops in Syria, we have troops in Africa, we have troops. I think the Afghan force that we had with 2,500 people, if you ranked where we have troops at right now that are not in the United States, and we're not at any war that I know of that currently exists, it was number 9 in the amount of troops. So,
really?
and I'm not saying that means you can't get out or anything like that, but I mean, it just seems like a lot of the time, and I think the biggest thing was, it wasn't like, look, I understand that everybody, every president that runs for president, at least the last 3, whether, Biden, Trump, Barack Obama, all said we want to get troops out of Afghanistan. But it wasn't like the masses of the American people were just demanding that we have to get these troops out right now. It wasn't like a prime issue. You know what I mean? So it seemed very weird.
To get out in, like, all of a sudden, let's abandon everything and just, like, fucking we're out.
For a timeline, for, I guess, an op or something, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, you actually, it kind of circles back to your point of, and I've thought about it, it's like, I don't know, but we're the United States of America, and we still have the most powerful military in the world, and we still have the capability to do whatever we want. And for us to not evacuate citizens, which is just, I don't know how you cannot do. I mean, to me, it's mind-blowing that was even a consideration to do something like that at all. Like, at all. They're citizens. We're not talking about world building or democracy building or anything like that. We're talking about American citizens. And then we leave more equipment there, and I heard this, and maybe I believe we give $3 billion to Israel every year, and a lot of people fuss about that. And I do think intelligence is also given to us by Israel because they have the Mossad is something that's very good, and and they're an ally in the region. But for us to give, the initial estimates were $80 billion in equipment, but maybe it's only 50. But in any event, it's very likely, and maybe I've heard that there was more equipment there, at least by cash value, than we've given Israel since its existence in 1946 or whenever it became a nation state. But in any event, for the same people that are complaining and bitching about $3 billion to Israel, and there's all this equipment there. You have that happen. Then you have all these people that helped us. And I'm talking about the people, obviously you have to vet people and things like that, and they're over there too. And if you are as powerful as the United States are, if you do something like that, it's difficult to imagine, when you're cynical at least, how something like that's not, at least at some level, intentional, or at least you had the choice, right? You had the choice. Intention, and that's what I mean by intentional, just you chose a path like that. And it's very weird. And I thought that what was going to happen was we're going to be like, okay, well, we're going to make sure every American gets out. Like, I thought we were going to curve back. If we're not done, whatever deadline is, whatever else happens, every American gets out. And that didn't happen. And this, and it's just, it's mind-blowing to me. It is honestly mind-blowing to me. And I don't understand how something like that could happen.
I don't know. And I don't know if these are true articles, but you even see stuff on LinkedIn. I don't know if you saw any of this, but somebody posted something like special forces ended up like going back in and doing like kind of unsanctioned extractions of, civilians or, people that assisted the military and things like that.
Yeah. And the State Department tries to take credit for stuff like that, like they evacuated people. I read a story today where someone essentially had people go in and save, I don't know exactly, they saved people. And for the first day, they marched like 300 miles. And then halfway through the second day, there were a couple like people that helped them from the government. And then as soon as they get back, they're like, we saved 4 more people. And the guy's like, you didn't save anyone. We had private people go over there to take care of this stuff, and you're trying to take credit for it. And I think there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of different people over there. But I think you're right. A lot of that stuff was happening where you have people in our military that have pledged their entire lives, and not just their lives, to protecting American citizens. And they see something like that, and it just isn't right to them. And they have the means and the capabilities and the connections to go fix something like that, and they do it. And I think it's a shame that our actual government can't do similar things in the same thing. Like, it was crazy to me. Initially, you were reading stories that we're going to go to the airport, and if you want to go home, you got to make it to the airport if you're an American citizen or our ally. And and you're also reading that the French and the British are basically sending their, I don't know what their special forces are actually called, but various groups over there that are going out into Kabul or other areas of Afghanistan and rescuing their citizens. And it's like, are we doing that? And they're like, well, we don't really know.
Yeah. Well, it seems like this whole, the reason why it seems weird to me is because I'm only getting this from social media for the most part, but, seeing a lot of soldiers and, people that are vets and stuff like that post about this, a lot of people in the military community are really pretty pissed about this. And based on the things that they're posting, it doesn't seem to me because they're like warmongering and they want to be there and all that stuff. I think there's people that have legitimate expertise in this area that are pretty upset by the way that we left this and the way that we handled this situation. I mean, look, if I was in that spot too and I had been in the military or I had been over there and I had really done a lot, put my life on the line, my guys' lives on the line, the people that work with them, their lives on the line to, try to make that a better place, I'd be pretty pissed that this is the way that we're leaving. And look, I actually am more, from what I know, I am more pro getting out of Afghanistan, getting out of Iraq. I mean, like, it just kind of baffles me that we're still, there at all. But to me, this was not the way to go. And
I agree. And I think that's how the soldiers feel about it. I don't think they're warmongers. Just like my arguments about where we have troops, I don't like war either. I mean, I think we talked about that with World War I and anything like that. I think the biggest problem looking forward is if you leave an area like that, who fills the void? And there are geopolitical players, and it's like, was the cost of 2,500 troops, or let's say we had to bump it to 10,000, I don't know. Was that, maybe that's not that expensive considering the alternative. And, you know, you think about China and Russia being in that area, you think about because, you know, apparently there's mineral resources in those mountains there that might actually play a huge part in the coming decades and centuries, might actually be important. Now, I know the United States, we may not take them, and we might not go over there and start mining that area. But that doesn't mean China won't. It doesn't mean Russia won't, right?
Well, and
you know what I mean?
It wouldn't mean that we wouldn't either.
It doesn't mean, well, that's fair too. And it doesn't, I mean, you know, you can look at it from different ways. But ultimately, I think you're right. But I think a lot of it, what most people are unified on is the way that it happened was terrible. And I think that as a fundamental thing, I just cannot understand how you could even think for a second that it's okay to leave American civilians there. And then I have, you know, one of the questions that I keep thinking about is they keep saying, well, first they said, if an American citizen wants to come home, they will come home. And I'm over here going, what's your definition of wants to come home? Like, for example, do you call everyone? And if, I don't know, they don't answer their phone.
They didn't want to come home.
They didn't want to come home, or they didn't reach out to you, or they didn't send you an email. Like, what does that mean? I mean, I just want to know, because you're talking about Afghanistan. And a lot of the focus seems to be around Kabul, but there are people in various pockets in Afghanistan that have been taken over by the Taliban a long time ago. It's like, how do you know they can even have the telecommunication ability to get out and reach out to you?
Yeah.
And it's like, you have to have some kind of idea of how many people are actually there. And to just kind of, you know, to gauge it down. Because remember, it started at 15 million, 10 to 15 million. And then all of a sudden they said we got 6 million, or I said million. Goodness, that'd be a lot. 10 to 15,000. And then they said we got 6,000 out and there's 250 people there. Now, I've heard that maybe they were counting green card holders before, but green card holders do have almost the same, they have the same right to be in the United States as a citizen has, okay? And I don't know the details, but we're getting no transparency on that. And the idea that you can say, I mean, even when they're making promises, if an American citizen wants to come home, they'll come home, or we're going to get every American citizen out. How can you say that if you don't know how many American citizens are there?
Yeah.
That's not a thing that you can do, and you're always probably going to miss the mark at some level. You read stories where some people that made it, and some people that didn't, there's like video accounts, they were trying to get through the Taliban checkpoints. They couldn't do it. And it's like, to me, that's a person that wanted to come home.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Not to mention, I think that if you didn't hear from somebody, it seems to me very, very, very unlikely that they would prefer to live there generally, you know. And I don't think it takes any level of rocket science or anything like that to figure something like that out, just as a general matter. But I don't know. It just, that whole thing baffles me.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
But so I guess changing course here. I do want to ask you about starting your own practice and how this came about. And so you've been doing it for 6 months now, right? As your own practice.
That's correct. Essentially, I was running my trust and estates department at my previous firm. And like I said, I mean, you can get, at any job you have, you can kind of get into the intricacies and the details, but, you know, it made sense for me to go out on my own and everything like that. And I kind of I was basically doing that anyway within the context of the firm.
Sure.
And you know, as far as practicing law, so it was taking on the business component on top of that really was the big difference. And that's a huge one, don't get me wrong, but, you know, but honestly, it's been a blessing. It's been unbelievable, and I'm glad that I did it.
Yeah.
Although scary initially, to say the least, right?
Oh yeah, it definitely is. Mm-hmm. I mean, what were some of the business side of things that maybe were like a wake up call for you, or something that you just really hadn't even considered before you jumped into this?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's as much as consider. Well, there's some of the stuff you don't consider, but I think it's the time. It's how much time it takes. Like, we have certain regulations that the bar requires us. Like, we have to monthly go and review our trust account to make sure that those are good. And, you know, and I like to do that with my operating account too as well. And I think more than anything else, even getting the entity set up, the operating agreements in place, the tax filings correct, meeting with accountants, interviewing people. To me, more than anything else, it's the amount of time that you devote to the business aspect that takes away from the practice. That's the thing that, you're not even working. You are, but in a very different context. You're not doing the work that you otherwise do. So I think that's the thing. And I think that was mostly true initially. I actually think that once you start to get in a groove a little bit and make sure that you take adequate time to do that, it's not really as much of a problem. But I would say that's the biggest thing right away, was realizing how much time this stuff took. So,
yeah. I kind of found the same as I went through this, and then kind of, I guess with that time is all of those small tasks that suddenly pop up that you really didn't consider were part of a business, whether it's the planning, then you've got changing insurance, going from working from somebody to myself, this bill, accounting software, email software. What am I going to use? How do I communicate with these people? It's like,
and when you don't have any of that, and you're trying to think of all the stuff that you do on the day-to-day basis. Like here's my biggest problem right now. I'm the IT guy. I don't know anything about computers, but I'm the IT guy, so it's stuff like that. Just,
Yeah. Well, I know a couple IT guys, and I'll kind of connect you with maybe one of them after this. He's pretty good. But awesome. Yeah, well, dude, thanks for coming and doing this.
Absolutely,
I really
man. I know we got
this.
on politics in the middle, but it's always good to talk. And and to be honest, sometimes it's good to get ideas out there, just generally speaking, because and on the platform that you're using, because it's always nice to have those type of conversations. Agree, disagree, it's still good to have it. But,
yeah, dude. And if you put it out there, and it's like, let's say we're totally wrong, or we didn't, we're not like, oh, okay, you guys aren't even seeing this 50% of the pictures. Like, that's part of the reason why I'm doing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is like, I do want to put my ideas out there because I want to talk. I want to experience the world. And if people want to come and criticize, like, I'm okay if people come and say like, hey, dude, you're wrong, and here's where you can, like, here's what I would check out to, better your worldview or something. Like, hell yeah, dude. But we don't have to all hate each other. And we also, like, I don't want to live in ignorance my whole life.
No.
Like, I don't want to be wrong about something and then, suddenly be making decisions for people, and like I'm just like a fucking idiot. Like, I would love to have somebody come, like,
well, that's what I was saying earlier when we were talking about, John Stewart. I mean, even some of the things that I am more convinced of than I've ever been convinced of anything. I was on the other side of that initially, which is why I'm so convinced that I knew the argument on the other side. I believe the argument on the other side, and now it's one of those things where you disagree, and it's not that I can't be moved from something like that, but I think ultimately, we're all so wrong, yet somehow we have this problem with saying things that may be wrong. And I think, again, when we talk about valuing an individual and understanding that they're just like us, whether it's, just friends that you have that disagree with you, we're all wrong. We've said so many wrong things in the last hour or two, or however long we've been doing this, that there's no telling. But the idea is we're also probably willing to accept the fact that if you demonstrate that we're wrong, okay.
Yeah,
I was wrong. But that's the kind of relationship that we should have with each other when we talk about different ideas, because we have to be able to have hard conversations. We have to, on an individual level. You don't have to go to the basketball game and talk, or football game and talk to your friends about this stuff at the game. But you know what I mean? At some level, we have to be able to have the hard conversation, right? And you can't silence that. So it is what it is. So, but anyway, I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thanks,
It was awesome to do it. All right.
I think we should probably do this again at some point.
Sounds good to me.
So before you leave, where should people go to follow you, learn more about what you do, get in touch with you?
Yep. All right. So it's the Merriman Law Firm. Again, my name is Robin. I go by Robbie, but Robin Merriman. My website is merriman-law.com. So that's www.merriman, which is MERRIMAN-law.com. You can, go there, visit the website. It's got all my contact information and everything like that. I'm happy to talk to anybody about their trust estates, guardianship needs. And obviously, if you come for a consultation and you decide that you also want to talk about history or politics, we will probably be doing that for another hour after our, consultation.
Cool.
So, yep.
And your children will not be part of that historical conversation.
That's right.
Cool. We go. But and I'll include all of this in the show notes so that way people can find you. But again, thanks, man. I appreciate you doing this.
Thanks, man.
Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Yep, thanks.